When Yul Brynner passed away on the 10th of October 1985, the world didn't just lose an actor, it lost a presence. The kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice to command a room. He had that rare stillness, the calm authority that made audiences believe he was a king, a gunslinger, or whatever role he stepped into. By then, Brynner had lived many lives. Born in 1920 in Vladivostok, he grew up between cultures, continents, and identities before eventually finding his way to America. He reinvented himself more than once. And when he shaved his head for The King and I in the 1950s, he turned what could have been a bold risk into a lifelong trademark. That role earned him an Academy Award in 1957 and secured his place in Hollywood history. But long before the tributes and the dimmed Broadway lights, there was 1960, a dusty film set in Mexico, a Western that would become legendary, The Magnificent Seven. That's where he worked alongside a young James Coburn. Coburn wasn't yet the James Coburn people would later recognize, the Oscar winner, the cool, laid-back presence with the unmistakable voice. Back then, he was still building his name, still earning his space in rooms filled with established stars. And Yul Brynner was very much an established star. By all accounts, Brynner took his work seriously. He understood how the camera saw him. He understood framing, posture, silence. Some described him as disciplined. Others described him as guarded. On a large ensemble set like The Magnificent Seven, that kind of personality can shape the atmosphere, sometimes positively, sometimes with tension simmering beneath the surface. James Coburn, on the other hand, had a different energy. He was tall, loose, easygoing. He didn't push. He observed. He had a dry humor that surfaced when you least expected it. He wasn't trying to dominate the frame. He trusted that if the moment was right, it would come to him. There were stories over the years about rivalries on that set, especially involving Steve McQueen and Brynner. But Coburn rarely fueled drama publicly. He didn't build his reputation on conflict. He built it on longevity. So when Brynner died in 1985, people naturally wondered which of his former co-stars would be there to say goodbye. Funerals are complicated things. They aren't red carpets. They aren't premieres. They are personal, private. Sometimes smaller than the public expects. Brynner's service was reportedly intimate, not a Hollywood spectacle. James Coburn's absence was noticed by some. But absence doesn't always mean resentment. It doesn't always signal unfinished business or hidden conflict. Sometimes it simply reflects the quiet reality of life. People drift, careers move, decades pass. By 1985, 25 years had gone by since those 7 men rode across the screen together. A quarter century. In that time, both actors had lived full, separate lives, different films, different families, different battles. What we do know is this: James Coburn never publicly attacked Yul Brynner. He never spoke bitterly about him, and he also never turned Brynner's death into a public performance of grief. And maybe that tells us something. Not every connection in Hollywood turns into lifelong friendship. Some are chapters. Important ones, memorable ones. But chapters nonetheless. In the end, what remains isn't who stood where at a funeral. It's the work they left behind. The way 7 men on horseback became part of cinematic history. When The Magnificent Seven began filming in 1960, no one on that set could fully predict what the movie would become. It wasn't designed to be a myth. It was simply a Western, a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, adapted for American audiences, directed by John Sturges. But the casting brought together something unusual. Yul Brynner was already a major name. He had won the Academy Award for The King and I in 1957 and had an international reputation. He wasn't just another actor in the lineup. He was the anchor. The studio saw him that way. The director treated him that way. And Brynner carried himself that way. Then there were the others: Steve McQueen, ambitious, hungry, watching everything; Charles Bronson, quiet, intense; Robert Vaughn, precise and intellectual; Brad Dexter, solid, dependable; Horst Buchholz, the youngest of the group; and James Coburn, tall, lean, still carving out his place. Coburn wasn't fighting for dominance. That wasn't his personality. He had studied acting seriously. He respected craft. He didn't need to outshine anyone. He trusted the camera would find him when it needed to. But ensemble films test people, on location in Mexico. The heat was relentless, long days, dust everywhere. Horses, gunfire, technical delays. When conditions are tough, personalities become sharper, power dynamics become visible. Brynner, by many accounts, was protective of his position as the film's lead. He understood that, in an ensemble, attention can shift quickly. A single reaction shot, a small gesture in the background, those things matter. He had fought hard to reach the top of Hollywood. He wasn't casual about keeping it. There are well-documented stories of tension between Brynner and Steve McQueen. McQueen would reportedly adjust his movements during scenes to draw the eye, shaking shotgun shells, fidgeting slightly, subtle attempts to steal focus. Brynner noticed, and he responded by negotiating camera angles, positioning, even physical blocking to maintain control of the frame. It wasn't open warfare. It was professional chess. James Coburn observed all of this. Years later, Coburn spoke about Hollywood with a kind of detached clarity. He understood ego as part of the industry. He didn't seem shocked by it. But that doesn't mean it left no impression. On screen, Brynner's character, Chris Adams, is the natural leader, calm, authoritative, controlled. Off-screen, the parallels weren't accidental. Brynner believed in presence, in maintaining an aura. He wasn't overly familiar. He didn't overshare. He kept a certain distance. Coburn was different, more relaxed, more approachable. He wasn't trying to project royalty. He was building longevity. That contrast can create quiet distance. Not hatred, not open hostility, but difference. And difference, over time, can turn into emotional space. When the film was released in October 1960, it didn't explode immediately in the United States. In fact, it performed better internationally at first. But over the years, it grew into something larger: television, reruns, cultural references, iconic status. The seven became linked forever. Yet after production ended, they didn't remain a tight-knit brotherhood. Hollywood rarely works that way. Projects wrap, people move on, careers diverge. Brynner continued playing commanding figures. He returned again and again to The King and I on stage. It became almost inseparable from his identity. Coburn took a different route, from westerns to spy films, to action roles, to comedies. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, he had established his own brand of cool. Not theatrical, not regal, effortless. They respected each other's talent. That much is clear, but respect doesn't automatically equal closeness. And by the time the 1960s turned into the 1970s, and the 1970s into the 1980s, their lives had grown in completely separate directions. So when Yul Brynner died in 1985, the question isn't necessarily whether something dramatic happened. The more honest question might be simpler: how close were they? Really, after that one defining chapter ended, after the Magnificent Seven wrapped in 1960, the cast scattered in different directions. That's the rhythm of Hollywood. You share intense months together. Then everyone returns to their own path. For Yul Brynner, the 1960s and 1970s were about maintaining stature. He had already achieved something rare: international recognition. He wasn't chasing fame. He was protecting it. He continued to take on commanding roles in films like Westworld in 1973, where he once again played a figure of quiet authority, this time a robotic gunslinger, controlled and lethal. But perhaps more than anything, Brynner returned again and again to The King and I. It wasn't just a role for him. It was a legacy. He performed it thousands of times on stage across decades. Few actors in history have been so closely tied to one character. For Brynner, stepping back into the king's robes wasn't repetition. It was identity. James Coburn's journey looked different. He embraced versatility. In the mid-1960s, he stepped into spy films like Our Man Flint, leaning into satire and charm. By the 1970s, he became associated with a relaxed, almost effortless masculinity. He didn't play kings. He played men who seemed comfortable in their own skin. There was also hardship. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Coburn faced severe rheumatoid arthritis. It slowed him down. It affected his mobility for a man known for his physical presence. That was no small challenge. He later spoke openly about that struggle. But at the time, much of it was private. Meanwhile, Brynner was fighting his own battle. Lung cancer, a lifelong smoker. He had been diagnosed in the early 1980s. He continued performing even as his health declined. There was a determination in him, almost defiance. When he finally passed away on the 10th of October, 1985, He left behind not only films, but also a recorded anti-smoking message that aired publicly after his death. It was direct, personal, and unusually vulnerable. Two strong men, two very different ways of handling time, illness, and legacy. By the mid-1980s, 25 years had passed since that dusty set in Mexico. 25 years is long enough for colleagues to become distant memories, long enough for priorities to change, long enough for people to respect each other and yet not remain part of each other's daily lives. There is no verified public statement from James Coburn explaining why he did or did not attend Brynner's funeral, no dramatic interview, no confession of regret, no open criticism. And that silence matters. Coburn was not a man who sought publicity around personal matters. He rarely used other people's deaths to create headlines. When he later won the Academy Award in 1999 for Affliction, he spoke about perseverance and gratitude. Not old rivalries, not past conflicts. Sometimes history wants a dramatic explanation, but the reality of human relationships is often quieter than that. It's possible that by 1985, Yul Brynner and James Coburn were simply former colleagues who had once shared an important chapter. A chapter that shaped both of their careers but did not necessarily bind them for life. Hollywood often presents unity on screen. Off-screen, life moves in separate directions. And as the years pass, even powerful collaborations can become memories rather than active bonds. The absence of a public display doesn't automatically mean the absence of respect. Sometimes it simply reflects the natural distance that time creates. When someone well-known dies, the public often looks for symbols. Who attended the funeral? Who sent flowers? Who spoke? Who didn't? But funerals don't always tell the full story of a relationship. Yul Brynner's passing in October 1985 marked the end of a remarkable life, one that began in Vladivostok in 1920 and stretched across continents, languages, and identities. He had reinvented himself more than once before Hollywood ever knew his name. By the time he became a star, he understood image, mystery, and control better than most. He guarded his privacy carefully. Reports at the time described his funeral as intimate. Not a massive Hollywood spectacle, but something smaller and more contained. That detail alone changes perspective. Private services are often limited to close family and a small circle of friends. Not every co-star is automatically part of that circle. By 1985, James Coburn was living a very different life than he had in 1960. His career had shifted. His health challenges were ongoing. The industry itself had changed. The old studio system atmosphere that once connected actors through contracts and repeated collaborations had long since faded. It's also worth remembering that the cast of The Magnificent Seven was not a lifelong fraternity. Steve McQueen would pass away in 1980. Charles Bronson's career moved in a different direction. Robert Vaughn became known for television, as much as film. Each of them carried that movie as part of their legacy, but they did not function as a permanent unit. Hollywood sometimes creates the illusion of permanent brotherhood. Audiences see seven men ride together and assume the bond lasts forever. In reality, film sets create intense but temporary communities. James Coburn never publicly criticized Yul Brynner. In interviews across the decades, Coburn spoke with calm honesty about his career, about ego in Hollywood, about lessons learned. But he was not a man drawn to revisiting old tensions for dramatic effect. If there had been deep resentment, it likely would have surfaced somewhere, especially in an era when memoirs and late-career interviews often revealed hidden conflicts. But nothing substantial ever emerged. That doesn't necessarily mean they were close. It also doesn't mean they were estranged. It simply means that whatever existed between them was not defined by public drama. And perhaps that is the most human part of this story. Not every meaningful collaboration turns into lifelong friendship. Not every absence signals bitterness. Sometimes it reflects distance created by time, circumstance, personality, or simply the quiet evolution of two lives moving in parallel rather than together. By the mid-1980s, both men had already secured their place in film history. Yul Brynner would forever be remembered as the king of Siam, as Chris Adams, as the figure who stood tall without raising his voice. James Coburn would continue his journey, eventually earning his Academy Award in 1999 for Affliction, nearly 4 decades after riding alongside Brynner on screen. In the end, what remains isn't a seating chart at a funeral. What remains are performances, frames of film, Moments captured in black and white and early Technicolor, 7 silhouettes against an open sky. As the years passed, the question about James Coburn and Yul Brynner slowly turned into one of those Hollywood footnotes, repeated often, rarely examined closely. But when you step back from the speculation, something clearer appears. By the time Yul Brynner died in 1985, he had already shaped his legacy with unusual precision. He had controlled his image for decades. He had turned The King and I into a lifetime signature. He had delivered a final public message warning others about the dangers of smoking, a message recorded while he knew his illness was terminal. That act alone tells you something about the man, disciplined until the end, aware of how his story would be remembered. James Coburn's story unfolded differently. In the late 1980s and 1990s, after years of health struggles, Coburn found a second wind. Treatments helped ease his rheumatoid arthritis. He returned to acting with renewed strength, and in 1999, nearly 40 years after The Magnificent Seven, he stood on the Academy Awards stage and accepted an Oscar for his role in Affliction. It was a long arc, a patient one, and if you listen to Coburn's speeches and interviews from that period, you hear gratitude, reflection, humor, not bitterness about the past. Not old grievances. He spoke about survival in Hollywood, about staying present long enough for the right moment to arrive. That perspective matters when revisiting the funeral question. There is no verified record of a dramatic falling out between Coburn and Brynner. There is no documented confrontation that fractured their relationship. What exists are anecdotes about tension on set, mostly involving Brynner and Steve McQueen, and the natural hierarchy that forms when established stars work alongside rising talent. But tension during production does not automatically translate into lifelong resentment. It's possible that Coburn simply wasn't part of Brynner's inner circle in 1985. It's possible schedules, health, or private circumstances played a role. It's possible the service itself was limited and deeply personal. Sometimes the most honest answer is also the least sensational one. Their lives had moved on. Hollywood history often tries to simplify relationships into dramatic narratives. Rivalry, betrayal, reconciliation. But most professional relationships are more ordinary than that. Respect without intimacy. Distance without hostility. When audiences watch The Magnificent Seven today, they don't see speculation. They see chemistry. They see 7 distinct personalities blending into one story. That achievement doesn't require lifelong friendship to remain meaningful. Yul Brynner died at 65, leaving behind a body of work that still feels composed and deliberate. James Coburn lived until 2002, passing away at 74 after building a career defined by resilience and quiet strength. 2 men, 2 strong presences. One shared chapter in 1960 that became part of cinematic history, and perhaps that is where the focus belongs. Not on who stood where at the end, but on what they created when they stood side by side. Because sometimes legacy is not about attendance, it's about impact. And on a dusty set in Mexico in the summer of 1960, that impact was undeniable.